So good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to welcome you to this afternoon's lecture. My name is Sarah Phillips. I'm the director of the Robert F. Burns Russian and East European Institute, and it has been a true pleasure this week to host Professor Sławomir Łotysz and his partner Magdalena Zdradowska, who gave us a wonderful talk yesterday afternoon on the history or deaf history of cinema in Poland and the United States. Today we're turning to quite a different topic. So Professor Sławomir Łotysz is professor at the Institute for the History of Science of the Polish Academy of Sciences, where he has been since 2014. He received his habilitation from the Institute of the History of Science of the Polish Academy of Sciences in Warsaw that same year in 2014. He was Andrew Mellon Fellow at the Netherlands Institute for Advanced Studies in 2014-2015, and the Charles Price Fellow at the Chemical Heritage Foundation in Philadelphia in 2007 and 2008. He was also the president of the International Committee for the History of Technology in 2017-2020. Dr. Łotysz's research interests include the history of invention, the environmental history of Polesia, the activities of the United Nations Relief and Rehabilitation Administration in Poland, and also disability and technology. I wanted to read off some of the titles of his books and articles just to give you a sense of the really broad nature of his interests. I find each and every one of his projects, which we have had ample time to discuss this week, just fascinating, and I think you all will too. And so perhaps we can get into some of those in the Q&A after today's talk. So he's published at least 4 books. The first in 2013 called Polish Invention in the United States. In 2018, followed by Polish Inventors, 100 Polish Inventors for the 100th anniversary of the Patent Office of the Republic of Poland. 2020, he published Factory with Gifts, Penicillin Beyond the Iron Curtain, 1945 to 1954. And then finally, hot off the presses is his 2022 book, Pińskie Błota, Nature, Knowledge, and Politics in Polish Polesia until 1945, published in Krakow by Universitas. So I don't think we have a physical copy to pass around, not yet. I think it's just gone to the printers, but many congratulations, and we're looking forward to hearing about this project. I promised to mention some article titles, and I will do that very quickly because I know we want to get to his talk. Here's a smattering of articles that I just pulled out of his CV that I thought really represented his work. Unused Capital, International Aid and the Beginnings of Vocational Rehabilitation in Poland after World War II. That was published in the Quarterly of the History of Science and Technology. Desert Mold, Witold Jaworski, how'd I do? And his work on crude penicillin in a military hospital in the Middle East in 1944, and that was in the Historical Quarterly Journal. Between Lwa and Stwiga, Stanislaw Kulczynski and his project to create a Polesian nature park from 1932. Another interesting article, Fighting Street Noise in Interwar Warsaw, Fashion or Necessity in Tekstil Drugia. Władysław Schafer and Józef Prudnik in the debate on the future of Polesian nature. Hot Commodity, Designing, Making, and Selling Electric Irons in Post-War Poland. And finally, my favorite title, Penicillin and Dentures. UNRRA's, that's the United Nations Relief and Rehabilitation Administration, in the reconstruction of the Polish medical industry after World War II. So, really fascinating topics, quite different from your book that you are going to tell us about on the Pripet Marshes, Nature, Knowledge, and Politics in Polish Polesie until 1945. I would like to thank our co-sponsors for this talk. Those include the Polish Studies Center, the Department of Slavic and East European Languages and Cultures, the Department of International Studies, and the Center for the Study of Global Change. So please help me in welcoming Professor Sławomir Łotysz.
Thank you, Sarah, for this wonderful introduction. I should add that all those titles you could hear is from the last 8 decades of my scientific career, so bear with me. So I'm very happy to be here to present this, actually not the book, but the topic which was haunting me for the last 6 years. First of all, I should perhaps explain. Yes, the book is really. Sorry, too many computers. The book is already at the publisher. It will appear exactly in 1 month from now. I'm very looking forward to have this hard copy. I wish I could have one to circulate. I think I should start with explaining what Pińskie Błota or Pripet Marshes really are, because maybe not all of you are familiar with this term. This is still the largest wetland area in Europe, although there were some draining works done in the past, but still this is about 100,000 square miles. As you can see here, now it's mainly Belarus and Ukraine, but in the pre-war period, that was the Polish-Soviet border, so the Pripet Marshes were basically cut in half between Poland in the west and Soviet Union in the east. And I'm focusing on this region actually, and I will show I will show you this map a little bit later. So first of all, let me tell you more about the environmental humanities, or more specifically environmental history, which now I'm engaged into. As Rodney Giblett, who has been writing extensively about Australian, Canadian, and British wetlands for the last 30 years, noted recently that Western culture denigrated wetlands as, to quote, places of darkness, disease and death, horror, slime and the uncanny, melancholy and the monstrous, and as a result destroyed them, end quote. This negative attitude toward wetlands has changed only recently. As John McNeill, one of the pioneers of environmental humanities, noted retrospectively in 2000, it happened sometime between 1960s and 1980s that, to quote, wolves graduated from varmints to noble savages, and swamps long suited only for draining had become wetlands worth conserving, end quote. Still in the early 1980s, when William H. Patrick from University of Louisiana applied for a grant to study circulation of plant nutrients between dryland and wetland, the clerk from funding agency, who has never heard such a word as wetland, corrected it in the application to wasteland, thinking that it was Patrick who made a typo in his application. Today we know that wetlands play many important roles in the ecosystem. I will name only three the most important ones. They regulate hydrological systems, preventing both floods and droughts on large areas downstream. Second, they are very rich and diverse wildlife habitats. While those two roles have been anticipated quite early, sometime in the early 1900s, The final blow to the theory that wetlands are wastelands came in the 1980s with a discovery that the wetlands are the most effective carbon sink, which are very effectively sequestrating greenhouse gases. Peatland specifically, which accounts for 3% of world's land area, sequester as much as 30% of greenhouse gases, more than all trees on the planet. But there is one condition: the peat must be a living peatland, and that means not drained at all. When peat dries out, it gives back to the atmosphere all carbon it sequestered for centuries or millennia, turning and then becomes, is turning from carbon sink to carbon generator. As it seems, the environmental history, or more generally, environmental humanities, is relatively recent discipline, and the wetlands as an object of inquiry is even a later concept. Since the mid-1990s, the wetland literature is steadily growing. So here you can have the basics. Some of those works took a form of so-called eco-biographies, which were devoted to some specific geographical objects, such as the Everglades, for instance, and Great Dismal Swamp as another, or to entire regions such as American Midwest. Most of the authors analyze many different aspects of human-wetland interaction, with a special focus on representation of swamps in culture. On more practical tone, some of those authors ponder on problems of wetland preservation and even their restoration. Rod Giblet, whom I mentioned already, while reconstructing an image of wetlands as a dead black waters, or places of disease, death, and melancholy, had particularly in mind the Anglophone culture. But as it appears from my own studies on Pripet Marshes, that applied also to Eastern Europe. As the environmental history is not the history of environment, my forthcoming book, Pripet Marshes, or Pińskie Błota, is not the history of wetlands. To some extent, it is the history of mutual human-wetland interaction. But my ambitious goal was to rewrite the history of this region, which used to be a central part of Polish so-called Eastern borderlands. When you look at its past, the past of this region, through the perspective of wetlands, you can see how powerful influence they had on all aspects of human life in this region. Have I accomplished this goal? I'm not. I hope so, and I will see from the reviews when the book is printed. The fact that this book is printed as we speak doesn't mean that this is I'm going to tell you something which is already finished and cannot be improved. So because I'm going to publish this book also in English, and I realize that the scope of this book should be more fitting to international readership. So I'm looking very much for your feedback and comments on this lecture. So before I briefly walk you through those 572 pages, which scares me a little, let me say a few words about my sources. It was, as for a historian, that was a quite typical set. That means archival sources from various archives across the globe, mainly from Poland and Belarus, but also Dutch, Russian, British, American, German, and Italian institutions were very helpful, especially if it comes to providing a global context to my arguments. Technical reports and scientific papers and monographs covering all wide range of disciplines from geology, hydrology, botany to agriculture and civil engineering. My sources were mainly in Polish, but also I used many Russian, English, German, Belarusian, Ukrainian, and Yiddish sources as well. So if it doesn't, if this set of sources is not unusual, then what makes me claim that I could reach some unusual results? This is about the perspective. So because that's one thing, and another is what I would like to emphasize here is advantage of transdisciplinary approach and transdisciplinary character of this research. Let me give you one example. So the Poleshuks, that means the indigenous population, as they were called, because they were calling themselves locals, that means tutejszy, or tutejszy, that means local, but the outside world was calling them Poleszuk, Pan Poleszuk or Poleshuks. They were, in general, they were illiterate, and they didn't leave too many written sources. And even the ethnographical observations that they were subjected to since the late 19th century did not give all the answers about the universe, let's say. But when we look through, at their history and the history of their relation with the environment through the perspective of the practices of resistance, we come to understanding them much better. For instance, they used to destroy canals, the melioration canals, the drain canals, by making dams at certain distances. And why it was attributed to the alleged backwardness, I see this as a way of adapting a new technology which was brought by force, actually, into the environment. They were adapting this technology to their own needs. By making those dams, they were creating ponds where it was much easier to catch fish, which was something they really loved to do. In fact, Poleshuks were against draining the marshes. This was because the very nature of the process. So that was also, when they were destroying, simply like burying the trenches, which were dug on the meadows, swampy meadows, they were again called like barbarians, like backward, and so forth. But as I say, this is the resistance to this was because of the very nature of peat. Just few words of explanation. How does it work? While peat is drained and its surface loses the normal moisture, it starts rotting, and that destroys the internal structure and chemical composition of this peat. So even if the whole mass of the ground, peatland, is still wet, this process destroys all the plants. So just after after just few weeks after the canals are dug, grass, the marshy grass, starts to fade away. It's called seeming or illusory overdrying. To take advantage of draining, one should sow different kind of grass. It's called sweet grass, and to use very expensive fertilizers. And Poleshuks didn't have money for this, and no one told them ever that they need to replace this grass to take advantage of draining this peatland. What they saw was destroyed meadow, and that's what they used to call it. The melioration is destroying their meadows. And for doing this, they were labeled as being backward, stupid, and uncivilized. And but as I say, to explain the reasons, one should look into the botany, soil studies, etc. and that's the advantage of transdisciplinary studies. Yeah, so although nature, knowledge, and politics, which I evoke in the subtitle, are very closely intertwined in Polesie's history, let me try unwrap this a little bit for you into those three main categories. So nature is the first one. I opened the book explaining how the marshes and swamps have become a subject of inquiry for researchers in humanistic studies. And then I go to the analysis of human-nature interrelations that touches such aspects as assumed impact of swampy environment on Polesiuk's character and as human beings. They were allegedly melancholic, not intelligent, and even lazy. And such untrue arguments were used to claim superiority of colonizers, mainly the Poles. No doubt, the nature had an impact on public health in this region. That includes malaria and other diseases endemic to Polesie, as well as those delusional conditions such as Pica polonica you may have heard of. That means in Polish kołtun. In my book, I deconstruct the deterministic and colonial image of Polesiuk as a victim of the environment. I also pay special attention to the dependence of indigenous economy on unique features of local environments, such as spring, floods, and omnipresent marshes. I analyze what were the environmental consequences of traditional fishing methods, cattle breeding, hay harvesting, and I ponder on how those activities would have been affected if draining plans were carried out in Polesie, because they weren't. Finally, I attempted to explain what the reasons for destruction of forests in Polesie were. One chapter is specifically devoted to an analysis of a national debate on nature protection in Polesie, which includes foreseen environmental consequences of planned drainage works. And I talk about plans to establish a national park with marshes as the main theme. I also evoke environmental issues in the epilogue of the book, in which I outline the disastrous consequences of Soviet drainage works carried out in Polesie after 1945. Now a few words about knowledge. Why knowledge is concerned, in this case, the indigenous knowledge of local populations in regard of how to use the local sources and how to interact with environment. So that's one thing I'm analyzing. Another is I pay special attention to reconstruction of the process of scientific exploration, like regular scientific exploration in terms of Western culture of this region in the 19th and 20th centuries. Doing so, I focus on how the growing knowledge on geological structure, climate, and hydrological system of Polesie led to understanding why Polesie got swamped in the first place and how it should be drained, because those two things were very much connected. By doing this, I also ponder on the role of scientists as both a tool of governance and active actors who are shaping the policy of the state. As befits a historian of technology, I explore the technical aspects of the drainage, which was emphasized in interwar Poland, as well as the role of engineers and other professionals in shaping the state's policy in this regard. I explained, for instance, the importance of Vistula-Dnieper waterway in economic and international settings of this period. I also outline a number of bold or one would say crazy engineering projects that assumed changing course of rivers, for instance, in Polesie, that also in very political settings. I bring to light at one end of one of chapters, I bring to light forgotten figures of Ukrainian engineers who worked for the Bureau for Melioration of Polesie, which was established in 1928. I also explained how the agricultural melioration were organized and structured at local and state level in interwar Poland, and I reconstruct the story of the mentioned Bureau for Melioration. And finally, the politics. As nature and knowledge, also the political issues are scattered throughout the book. So it's very difficult to to divide between the chapters. I mean, to group them. I begin with an analysis of the position of drainage in the discourse of power and modernity. I look at the marshes as a symbol of struggle between human and nature in Johann von Goethe's Faust, and the works undertaken on the ground by the Pope Pius VI, or Pius, I don't know, Frederick the Great, the democratic Netherlands, and the fascist Italy. I also discussed Russia's policy toward the melioration of Polesie in the 19th century, and after moving to interwar period, I outlined the position of this region in Polish plans of political, economic, and cultural domination over so-called eastern borderlands. Military considerations played an important role in shaping Polish policy toward this region in that period. To shed some light on this aspect of Polesie's history, I reconstructed how the views on the strategic and tactical values of marshes as an obstacle in military operations evolved over time. I did it by placing the policy of Polish military authorities toward Pripet Marshes against changing environmental, political, and technological determinants. In this book, I also brought to light a chapter of Polesie's history that was virtually non-existent in historiography, namely the aspiration of Polish Jews to engage in drainage works. They offered to secure international loans necessary for this enterprise in anticipation that Polish authorities will grant them access to land and let engage in agricultural activity. Yeah, that's basically the chapter number 9. I reconstruct the reactions of Sanacja and Endek political cycles, that means far-right political cycles, to such a project, which eventually didn't come into being. In conclusions, I debunk the government's policy in this regard as instrumentally using the aspirations, the Jewish aspirations, to its own goals. Finally, I briefly outlined the story of Polesie after the Second World War broke. I analyzed how an image of Polish government not being able to drain and develop Pripet Marshes was used in Soviet propaganda campaign, legitimizing the taking over this territory on September 17, 1939. I also analyzed how Nazi propaganda used forged information about Jews carrying drainage works in Polesie to cover up the ongoing Holocaust that happened in 1941. I mean, that started this forged news. Then I explained the role of Polesie in post-war plans of the Polish government in London, as well as in the agenda of British and American negotiators in Tehran and Yalta. So as you can see, it's very difficult to disentangle this triad, nature, knowledge, and politics. My point is that, especially in the case of Pripet Marshes, this region, nature, knowledge, and politics cannot be simply told separately. Or rather, the history of Polesie cannot be fully told if restricted to political issues, as it is usually done in current scholarship. And I will try to prove it using one example. So let's go back to our maps. So as I mentioned, that's the square symbolizes the territory, the part which I'm analyzing the most fully. So that's the region as it looks now. I apologize for Polish descriptions that I created those maps for my books. And now, of course, those geographical objects are called, should be written in Cyrillic, but that's just to give you the impression. So today, north you have Belarus, south you have Ukraine. In the interwar period, you can see the Polish-Soviet border on the right side. When we go here, it's like under the Tsarist rule, that the whole area, of course, was within Russia. Those two canals, which were and still are, in some sense, or they were, let's say, in this form, very important because they connect Black Sea and Baltic Sea. So Canal Królewski, which is like basically Bug-Dniepr Canal and Canal Ogińskiego. They were both built still in pre-partition Poland. That means in 18th century. When we get back even a long time ago, that's the best expression. And so the green part, this is those are the marshes, the actual marshes, and the blue one is the extent of spring flood, which happened almost every year, and that had a great impact on Polesia's history. But yeah, I'm not going to go back more into the past, because then I would have to tell you about post-glacial waters, sand deposits and changing winds that shaped Polesia landscape for the next millennia and determined the lives of people who settled in this weird environment. Those people adapted to severe conditions they found there quite in a quite handsome way. The shortage of arable lands, poor quality of marsh grass, and constant floods, as I mentioned. Their main activity was herding cows, but those were not ordinary cows, as you can see. They were grazing on meadows and forests from early spring until the fall. They were wading in lakes and marshes and even swam across the rivers. To make sure that the beloved commodity, as Polesiuks used to call their cows, had enough hay for winter season, from early spring until the fall, the Polesiuks were mowing so-called sour marsh grass. It was the most arduous seasonal job in their portfolio, I could say. They stayed on remote marshes for weeks, having very little to eat, to drink, and were sleeping in wet conditions, constantly attacked by gut flies and mosquitoes. When hay was dry, they were taking it home on their canoes. But most of the hay was kept on the stacks on the marshes. From some locations, they could be brought home only after the marsh froze. Either in the open field or near the house, the stacks had to be elevated to avoid moisture and floods when the water goes up, even as high as this. Nature recompensated all those hardships with abundance of fish, water birds, as well as other animals such as beavers, turtles, and elks. There were also wolves and bears. Polesiuks had to compete with the latter ones for the treat they both loved, that means honey. They were, since the beehives were usually placed on trees to protect them from climbing birds, Poleshuks built platforms like those with wooden nails protruding against the bird climbing from down. Cutting trees and rafting wood was another important occupation for many Poleshuks. Some of them were seen traveling on their rafts as far as to Gdańsk on Baltic Sea. They lived quasi-nomadic lives. That applied particularly to those living on the river plains, but it should be noted that in Polesie this expression river plains was literally very broad. During the spring flood, the so-called Pińsk Sea or Pińskie Morze was sometimes was as wide as 20 kilometers. That's the view from one of the churches in the town. During the flood, Pińsk had its most prosperous days as a trading post. Ships and barges with Ukrainian grain coming from Dnieper River were sailing straight here, taking shortcuts across the marshy terrain, which in so-called dry season one could not pass at all. Then the grain was sent farther by small barges and canoes, because the only way to Baltic ports through Ogiński Canal or Królewski Canal, the two of them I showed you on the map, were good for as small tonnage as 100 tons only. During the flood, which occurred almost every spring and lasted up to 8 weeks, thousands of people had to seek temporary homes and temporary occupation. In fact, because the flood was rather an unexpected phenomenon and not as disastrous as we may think, this temporary break in terrestrial way of living was turning Poleshuks into aquatic species. In 1865, Vincent Paul, Polish adventurer, writer, and geographer, depicted this flood in his once famous play, The Flood, romanticizing this phenomenon which he witnessed himself while traveling through Polesie sometime in the 1830s. Poleshuks, Roma, and Jews, mixed all together, lived like squatters on islands called Ostrów, and those that means the tops of little hills, or technically speaking dunes, protruding above the surface of Pińskie Morze or Pińsk Sea. During that period, the normal law was suspended, and Poleshuks followed the so-called coastal or bank law, prawo brzegowe, which allowed them to keep anything which was brought by water. Such practices were prohibited already by Constantine the Great and disseminated wherever Rome law was adopted. But it survived in Polesie at least until the 19th century. While normal law was called terrestrial or lord's law, the coastal law was called aquatic or people's law. For those few weeks, Polesie was a scene of ongoing Saturnalia, as ancient festival when social roles are suspended or reversed, and all people are equal. But life in Pripet Marshes was not as romantic as Vincent Paul might have remembered after 3 decades that passed since his trip. About the turn of the 19th century, the region was experiencing a dramatic change, dramatic socio-economic changes. According to Joseph Obremski, an anthropologist and ethnosociologist who did extensive field studies in Polesie in the 1930s, because of the composition of traditional social structure of Poleshuks community, local population skyrocketed. This, in turn, made a huge pressure on environment. To meet the growing needs for food, using old practices, Poleshuks had to burn more forests to clear more arable land, collect more hay to herd more cows, catch more fish, etc. It was truly a robbery economy which added to destruction caused by Polish and Russian landowners, as well as speculators and capitalists who exploited the local commodity the outside world desired the most, that means the timber. From the 1860s, with the introduction of railway, the capitalist economy made its way to Polesie. A decade later, the Tsarist government launched a so-called Western expedition to drain marshes. During the next 25 years, 2.5 million hectares were drained, mainly in eastern part of Polesie. The main concern of Russian government was to foster agriculture and forestry production in this region, which was considered the most backward in European part of the empire. As a result, the area available for traditional indigenous economy of Poleshuks shrunk even more. By the end of First World War and after re-emergence of the Polish statehood, those problems did not disappear. In contrary, they even aggravated. Forests were devastated both by the occupying Germans and the local populations once the managers and owners of land estates fled or vanished in the war. Many hydrotechnical works already built there were destroyed, and canals dug by the Western expedition overgrew, which resulted that with the return of swamps on large areas. Yet, Polesie was an attractive asset for a new Polish state. Polish negotiators in Versailles in 1919 had a clear instruction to gain as much of Polesie as possible, drawing the eastern border through the center of Pripet Marshes as a minimum. This was for two reasons. One, explained by Józef Piłsudski, the leader of the country, was military in nature. Marsh border offered more protection from the east, as it was expected that east would be a trouble in the future. The second reason was outlined in 1970 by the so-called father of Poland's eastern policy, Leon Wasilewski, who said that controlling, to quote, dark masses of Poleshuks for their complete lack of national awareness, end quote, would be beneficial for Poland, as they would become a material for Polonization. Eventually, the border was traced as a result of Polish-Russian war, and it was sealed by the Riga Treaty in 1921. Let me focus on this aspect. Let's take a look at a map drawn by Luciusz Dura in 1918, showing distribution of Poles on so-called Polish lands. The purpose of this map was to legitimize Polish claims at the negotiation tables in Versailles and Riga. But this map has been very much manipulated. While red color means an absolute or relative majority of Poles in certain areas, different shades of pink mean percentage from 30% to as low as 5%. But still, they built a solid block supposedly populated by Poles. I don't know whether Polish negotiators managed to trick anyone in Paris or Riga with this map, but it appears that they got tricked themselves to a certain extent. Look at this white wedge protruding from the east into this very solid Polish territory. That's Pripet Marshes. This image, maybe not this particular map, but it built or rather perpetuated an image of Polesie as no man's land, as void space which is awaiting Polish colonists to settle there and to toil, and here's another myth, the fertile soil. It wasn't so fertile. The image of this illusionary void hunted Poles until the end of the interwar period, and, I argue, was a powerful force in Poland's drive to drain Polesia. In mid-1920s, when the national debate on how such enormous engineering enterprise should be accomplished has just begun, it was thought that there would be a land for at least 1 million of settlers, plus a few millions more in towns which would emerge there. The hunger for land was the most severe in western and southern Poland, and the settlers supposed to come right from there. Such a move seemed to have many benefits: less tensions among landless farmers in the west and south, less emigration to foreign lands from those territories, more agricultural products on the market, more taxes in the state treasury. But the most desired advantage was a, to quote, corrected ethnic structure of Poland's eastern borderlands. In most of those calculations of that period, it was assumed that only the ethnic Poles were allowed to settle there, which would form a so-called Polish wedge separating Belarusians in the north and Ukrainians in the south. Poles, through the supposedly cultural and economic dominance, supposed to facilitate Polonization of this dark mass of Poleshuks, to quote Wasilewski again. All analysis seemed to be showing that Polesia is the only place suitable for Polish colonization at that period. All those, arrows showing where to put the surplus population. However, sometime in mid-1930s, a statistician from General Statistical Office in Warsaw, Ludwik Grodzicki, did the math again. He took into considerations data that anyone else apparently, that all of others apparently missed. The density of population in Polesia was indeed 3 to 4 times lower than an average in Poland, but all areas that were suitable for agricultural activity and habitation were already densely populated in Polesia. In many cases, they were populated even more densely than those regions in western and southern Poland from which the settlers supposed to come. The marshes were indeed empty, so it was obvious that the only draining would open any space for peasants there. But when Grodzicki calculated that this surplus land should be distributed among the landless Poleshuks in the first place, because those arable areas, as I said, were populated and overpopulated as well, and people had very little land there. The remaining area, which could be divided between peasants coming from ethnic Poland, would be extremely small. The recent findings prove that marshes in Polesia were, as I mentioned, were not as fertile as it was imagined. So in order to create self-sustainable farms, they should be at almost twice as large as it was initially thought. Taking all those facts into account, Grodzicki came to the conclusion that the final number of settlers which could be accommodated in, which would find home in Polesia, would be 4 times lower than it was thought initially. The pro-government press instantly named him as being against a great modernization plan, but nothing could change the numbers. The drive toward realization of this project lost its vigor, which, in addition to the opposition from the military cyclists, which considered Pripet a barrier against the Soviet aggression, eventually brought the project to a halt. At the same time, one can see a growing brutalization of internal policy of Polish government in eastern territories, especially in Polesia, which was particularly targeted in the Polonization project, which was realized among other ways through education. I argue that and that's the boldest claim I make in this book, that it was not a coincidence at all, but a result, I mean this brutalization was a result of lost hopes for strengthening Polish dominance over Polesie through its melioration and colonization by so-called Polish element. So, how did it end? Poland has not even started draining Polesie before the war broke. Polish society was generally tired with ongoing debate on how their lives would have been improved if Pripet Marshes were eventually drained. No surprise, jokes like this about draining or literally drying out Polesie started to appear in popular press. Polesie has been partially drained by the Soviets after 1945. It ended with partial desertification. Sandstorms and huge fires of pit soil have become a common phenomenon in today's Polesie. Would Poles avoid the mistakes the Soviets committed? I doubt it, as the problem lies in the desire to destroy marshes, and that feeling not only Poles and Soviets, but practically all other so-called civilized nations shared until very recently. Thank you very much.
So we have time for questions and discussion.
Sure, please. Thank you very much, Sławomir. I've never thought in this way about like shaping the border, the eastern border of Poland. And I've been reading a lot about this, but not in this perspective. That this was really fascinating. Could you elaborate a little bit on what I would be interested in? The negotiation over the eastern border after the Second World War. I mean, you mentioned the great power negotiations, so we are talking about Tehran and Yalta very much. Was this argument of the nature also taken into consideration when it was discussed how the border between Poland and the Soviet Union is going to be shaped after the Second World War? Because it seems to me with this image that you said that Poland really lost the argument, like this will contribute to the development of this area by drainage, because this has never done anything like before the war. Was it discussed and what the argument of these negotiations?
Good question. Thank you very much. This is maybe yes. There was a quote from Churchill saying that something like this. Stop complaining about what you are losing in the east, because you are losing swamps which are not developed anyway. And you lost the population which is not yours. That's another interesting quote, because Mikołajczyk was referring to millions of Poles which are left beyond the border, and Churchill was referring to Ukrainians and Belarusians who are not Poles. And he was particularly referring to swamps, which is again dark place, and Poles should be happy that they are living this, and they are getting what they get instead is a much better developed German territory, and that was recalled in that conversation at some point. I should look into my book to see exactly when, but that's maybe after. And yes, what is very interesting what was interesting in those negotiations. Roosevelt was going there. I mean, now that was to Yalta. With a report in which, I mean, I read this report and it gives like 10 options of Polish-Soviet border. And the question of securing future Poland with some sort of space east of Bug River to prevent, to be able to protect the country if, apparently the Americans didn't assume that, or they assumed, but maybe they didn't assume that that would be to such extent that Poland would be subject to Soviet Union to such an extent. But anyway, there were several options to draw this border east of how it was done actually, and there was also a reference to the marshy area, marshy character of this area as something which would add to Polish capability to protect or to secure the eastern border from eventual attack from Soviet Union. And that was touched in this, that was mentioned in this respect.
Yeah, it seems like it was the only one argument, because I believe that about the ethnicity there was...
Yes, of course, yes, and of course, that was of course in some sense a simplification what I was telling you now, and I didn't mean that was of course the only one or the most important one. The point is that when I look at this story from the perspective of marshes and this environmental perspective, is that what I see in a mainstream of history is neglecting those arguments. And I'm not saying by bringing those arguments, I'm not saying those were the most important or no. I'm saying that was another argument. So like adding this to the larger and fuller picture.
Questions for the speaker?
I just have a quick question. So nowadays, are there any remnants of this culture that you kind of described in this region, or it's completely gone?
You mean what I was referring to, those floods and all that kind? It's gone. Yeah, it's gone. It's gone. There are some ethnographic studies in the 2010s performed by some Polish researchers, and there is a memory of this pre-melioration period, which doesn't apply to 19th century, but still to the 30s, which was very much like in the 90s, in this sense that there was no melioration done at all. So people who remember and who recalled, the Poleshuks, nowadays Poleshuks, they remember the Polish period as, that's quite ironic, they remember this as a period where everything was in order. So pre-Polski, everything was fine, and under Soviets, there are no mushrooms in forests, there are no fish in rivers, and in Polish times there was plenty of fish and everything. So this lack of, that's a shift of perspective, because at that time, when a government was not doing anything in regard of melioration, then, oh yeah, that's backward government, they are not running this country properly, the Soviets were using this in their propaganda, etc., etc. But from the people's perspective, this lack of over-governance, let's say, was seen as something like a, I don't know, like a golden era of freedom. Thank you.
You made a brief reference that you talk in the book about the relationship between the marshes and the Holocaust. And what would that be? Could you explain that?
All right. Sometime in the German propaganda was using a picture of Jews being taken from ghettos and taken to Polesie to a productive work on melioration of the swamps. And I traced this to the first information which made into the West, and that was a Swedish newspaper from October 1941. And this particular reference to like there's nothing to worry about that Jews are disappearing or being taken from ghettos. They are being taken to the marshes, and they simply work, which is hard job, but no one was referring to anything dangerous like genocide being committed already then. And this single message, which was brought by a Swedish correspondent from Berlin, and that was repeated all over the world. I traced this back through Jewish Sentinel, for instance, and all Jewish newspapers in the States, which were referring to this particular note. And this is even, this can be found even in memoirs of Polish survivors of Holocaust, who after the war they were saying that they felt or they wanted to feel sure that the members of their families were taken to swamps, and that's it. That Auschwitz was not, or Belzec was not the reason. They don't hear from them anymore, and this lie was so strongly embedded in this propaganda that and because it was repeated by the Western sources as well, that until today the Holocaust deniers are using this to deny that the Holocaust happened at all, because they were taken to, Jews were taken to swamps.
But this ties into the debate on the origins of how the final solution would be implemented. There's been recently a debate between Peter Langerich and Christopher Browning, but many other scholars take part in this. Allegedly there were two options. One, death through labor, which is deportation to the east, and the other one would be extermination by gas. And the debate is about when the Germans decided that it would be the latter rather than the former. So this is very interesting from that perspective.
I think that adds something to this discussion, could add something to this discussion. But I was quite surprised that this wasn't traced at the publications I'm familiar with.
Thank you, it's very interesting.
Thank you.
I know that the draining didn't really happen until even when the war broke out, but I wonder if there's any discussion, not from the perspective of the state policy, but private initiative or private programs trying to develop some part of the marshlands, do their own things. Not part of the state policy, or not even part of some kind of nationalist project, but it's more like business people or even local people trying to do something and for their own motives.
Good question. Yeah. The point is that in Polesie, large areas were state-owned, and of course, still there were like very big landowners, like noble families, and some of them wanted to drain those lands, some didn't. For instance, Radziwiłł, who owned like hundreds, thousands hectares, he wanted to keep his swamps as as a hunting ground, and that was the region which was eventually pointed at as the location of a future national park in Polesie. And actually here, I mean, today in Belarus there is this the Olmańskie Bałata. That's the region where one of those zapowiedniks or national parks is located. But most of the private initiatives which were undertaken in the 30s were blocked by military because of the whole system was built like this, that if you wanted to take such a enterprise, I don't know, cut down your forest or drain your swamps to make meadows, for instance, then you had to apply through all the stages of administrative structure, and military was one of those. And they were blocking all the investments in that was very difficult to establish because even different how to say, like military authorities in different regions had different policies in this. And Polesie was actually cut almost in half between two regions, two headquarters, let's say. And yes, and they were actually blocking, like half of Polesie was excluded from any investment, and only in very, very rare occasions they were giving the consent to do something, which is quite interesting. The military authorities were more eager to give such a to agree on such a investment if Polish settlers or Polish owner was applying for this. If that the land would, I mean, the land after draining would go for the benefit of locals, then no. So everything was let's say directed to strengthen economic, political position of Polish state and Poles in this region.
And for one or two more questions?
Yeah, well, thank you very much for the fascinating talk. It's like, I mean, I've always found what do you call it, the canal policy between the Volga and the Pripet. It's shown in the modern maps, even though I understand it's been blocked by a Soviet concrete dam like decades ago. But the Oginsky Canal, it is the first time I've seen it mentioned since in my childhood in an atlas published in 1946. Back when it still must have been a good concern. So now obviously the relationship between Poland and Belarus is not very good. But in principle, if, as I'm sure a lot of people in Poland hope, Belarus someday becomes again an alive Poland and I guess Protestant Ukraine, do they have already plans for the restoration of this Dnieper to Vistula waterway? Or it's just too shallow to be practical for modern lessons?
Yeah, another good question. Thank you very much. Now it's quite difficult, but the project, this is called like European Waterway. If I remember well, E40. That's the general waterway, like from Rhine River to Volga even. So that's the missing link, actually. I mean, the Soviets, of course, improved that waterway, and this, let's say, in the entire framework of waterways, European waterways, the concept of this waterway is still live. I mean, it is considered as a very important waterway, but of course, so I don't think that. Of course, the now it's difficult to think about this at this moment, but that was also quite surprising for me to hear a few years ago that the current Polish government is seriously thinking about improving this waterway. And there is a quite big problem. That means that if you open such a big waterway, that means big in the sense that I don't know, 1,000 tons barges, for instance, that's like a minimum now. You need to provide water at the top point of this water, and there's no water. There's a shortage of water in this area, because what we could see in the abundance of water, it's very illusionary. The amount of raining is like it's like a step almost. That means like a prayer in this region. So that's the biggest problem of this waterway.
So basically the place is wet not because the rains are, but because the drainage is poor.
Sorry?
So basically that place is a wetland, not so much because it rains so much, but because the drainage is very poor. So the water just stays there.
Over a few years of writing this book, I'm not a fan of draining anymore. Sorry?
The natural drainage is poor.
Yeah, the reason why the Soviet draining of this area ended with a sort of ecological catastrophe was that they didn't pay attention on different kind of the geological structure of this. The layer of peat is very thin. In some places it's thick, and down there you have sand. So I remember one of those a report of a Polish journalist who flew over Belarus in the 50s and to see how those great works are progressing, and he wrote something which struck me. In the newspaper, that he could see those trenches, the big trenches being dug by huge machines, and like patchwork of different colors of land, of ground, and he saw white and yellow sand. I said, what? So that means that the Soviets were digging this. They dug as deep, so they reached the layer which the water just flew through this and just gone. And they were using big machines to speed up the process, but those machines were digging too deep. They overdrove this thing, and then the fires, the fires came. So, talking about poor drainage quality, I would say, God save poor drainage quality. That's good for us. Yeah, but some things cannot be reversed. Peat, when it's drained, and it dies. And what happens with peat? It simply disappears. The field of drained peat is, the lower is going down every year a few centimeters, and nothing you can. It's not about your human activity. It's simply the over-dried peat decomposes itself. And the carbon is going up, and that's the carbon generator. Then you can even have like a meadow created over it, but then it still goes down, and carbon goes up. So it's a bad thing.
So Sławomir, thank you for this wonderful talk. I guess I'll give myself the privilege of the last question. You and I had a fascinating kitchen table conversation. I hope you don't mind that I bring this up about how the story of the Pripet Marshes is tied to the history of your own family.
Okay.
There are students here, and I think they would be really fascinated, as would the rest of us, to hear about how one begins a project, right? What are the inspirations and roots of a project? So could you tell us a little?
All right. So in short, my grandma and my mom were born in a small town up there, Bereza Kartuska. You can see this next to Prużana. And of course, that's my heritage. And my grandfather was Polish, so I should say this. So if I make jokes about Polish, then I can do this because. How the topic was born? Do you really want me to tell this? Yeah, I was hiding myself just on Christmas Eve to save myself from being engaged in preparations, and I grabbed an old journal, Przyroda i Technika. I think that was the Nature and Technology from the 30s, reading about a dynamite way of digging canals, and I thought that's cool. And the note was like that speedy way of making canals would be very useful in draining Polesie. And then I looked into I got more interested in this. I mean, even more. And then I realized when any draining of Polesie project, big whatever that could be, was done, I thought to myself that this is that's the question that makes me curious even more. It's not accomplished projects are you can read about them everywhere. Like this is something you can find in any history book. But what about the projects which were not realized? And then you ask questions why. What were the reasons why such ambitious, such really important modernizing project as it was presented was abandoned, or why it wasn't realized? What were the obstacles? What were the actors who were against this? And that made me even more curious. And the next year I had already a grant for this. So.
Well, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thanks to everyone for coming.